It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Adam Houston. So Dr. Houston received his BSc in psychology from the University of Alberta, and he went on to do a Doctor of Law from the University of Victoria, and then an MA in Global Development Studies at Queen's University, where he was nominated for a Governor General's Award. He went on to do a Master's of Law from the University of Washington School of Law, and he has completed, I guess, most of the requirements for his PhD of Law at the University of Ottawa in December 2021, where he was a CIHR Fellow, as well as a member of the Human Rights Research and Education Center. He currently serves as the Medical Policy and Advocacy Officer for Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. Dr. Houston's focus is on law and policy at the intersection of global health and human rights, with a particular emphasis on infectious disease and access to medicines. He's worked with organizations around the world on issues such as United Nations accountability for the Haitian cholera epidemic and reconciling disparate legal policy approaches towards HIV and tuberculosis. So thanks very much, Adam, for joining us, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
All right, everybody can hear me. No, thank you very much for that introduction and the hopefully not too premature promotion to doctor, especially if my parents are watching this. Anyway, normally this is where I'd also pander and say it's really great to be back in Edmonton, although at the moment I'm not, except perhaps in spirit. I also know this is a health crowd, and I know health audiences are really keen on conflict of interest slides. So, gotta make sure I get the arrows. Yeah, we'll get that out of the way. My outrageous bias in favor of people having access to medicines, and the fact that is also my day job. I should say that I'm not here today in that official capacity. So anything I say or the grumpiness with which I say it is all on me. Okay, and there's lots to be grumpy about when it comes to vaccine inequity, not least of which the fact that it didn't have to be this way. And for a brief shining moment there, it looked like it might not. It looked like world leaders like this guy were actually on the cusp of ensuring equal access. Unfortunately, while the world aced the science exam when it comes to these vaccines, we failed the ethics test when it comes to the rollout. And so that failure extends to things like the COVAX facility, which even despite a big surge in December, still delivered well under half of the vaccines it was intended to deliver in 2021. Moreover, it's become heavily dependent on vaccine dose donations by wealthy countries who in turn have really fallen far short of living up to their pledges. Canada, for instance, hasn't delivered a single dose in the past 3 weeks and has still in total delivered fewer doses than it has had in federal freezers in Canada on a single day. But focusing on doses and the dose donations and the failure to live up to them overshadows a bigger issue. I mean, dose donations is always going to be a stopgap measure, and indeed, COVAX was not supposed to be dependent on dose donations. In fact, it was designed without a mechanism for dose donating. Instead, what it was supposed to be was pooled procurement, essentially, where yes, high-income countries were subsidizing low-income countries, but all participating countries would have had equal access, at least to enough doses to protect the most vulnerable populations. Instead, we have ended up with the current situation where low-income countries have been punted to the end of the line, waiting for scraps. So how did this come about? Well, there's a number of failings here, but one of the key failings is that rich countries bought up most of the vaccine supplies before COVAX got anywhere near them. Indeed, some countries continued to sign bilateral deals months after it became apparent that they were subverting COVAX. So, you know, when we criticize countries like Canada, as I will be doing, it's important to criticize them about the right things. Canada did have every legal right to take doses from COVAX in the first round as the only G7 country and one of the only high-income countries to do so. Indeed, COVAX was set up so that all participating countries could take doses out. Where Canada, in my view, loses its moral right to take doses from COVAX is in all the ways that it was subverting the mechanism in other ways. After all, this is the country that trumpeted the fact that it was the country that secured the most doses per capita of any country in the world by late 2020. It secured about 11 doses per capita through bilateral contracts. And that procurement strategy perhaps made sense at the beginning when these contracts were signed. Didn't know if any of these vaccines were going to work. What's very troubling is what Canada did or didn't do after it became apparent that most of these vaccine candidates were effective. So Canada, despite securing more than 400 million doses for 38 million people, didn't even pledge to share a single one of those doses until July of 2021, which not coincidentally is also the same month that Canada physically received enough doses to double vaccinate every person who was then eligible. Canada didn't actually deliver a single dose to COVAX until September. And Canada was not the only country engaging in practices like this. But all of these issues have been heightened by the emergence of the Omicron variant. And even without going into the discussion of unvaccinated populations and risk factors for the emergence of new variants, this has led to a situation where rich countries are going for third, or in some cases, even fourth doses. I've seen the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday. And of course, this is at a time when the lowest income countries close to about 10% mark, even for first doses. So, I will suggest that those countries that took more than their share at the beginning and then have subsequently gone back for third or fourth helpings have a particular responsibility when it comes to acting on the adage that the pandemic isn't over anywhere until it's over everywhere. And one piece of this puzzle is intellectual property. To be very clear, this is not the only piece of the puzzle. This is not the solution in and of itself. However, it is the piece of the puzzle that I was invited here to talk about. So I will. So the highest profile proposed intervention here is the TRIPS waiver. So at the World Trade Organization. So this was proposed by South Africa and India in October of 2020. A revised version in May of 2021 as sponsored by more than 60 countries and has the support of more than 100, so the majority of member states. Unfortunately, the WTO at this stage operates on a consensus basis. So that's where things are stuck. So what is the waiver? What does it do? Well, the waiver is a temporary waiver of obligations of member states to implement certain intellectual property protections. So these include patents. It also includes some other things like industrial designs, certain protections of undisclosed information, and so on. And this applies to tools needed in the COVID-19 response. So not just vaccines and drugs, but things like diagnostics or PPE or ventilator parts. But the flip side of the waiver, waiving the obligations for individual states, is that even if the waiver passes, it doesn't actually oblige states to waive these obligations at home. So if you're a country, let's call you Canada, you would not actually have to apply this waiver at home if you didn't want to. You could merely get out of the way and allow other countries to do so. So anyway, here's a map of the state of support for the waiver. This map very diplomatically reflects Canada's official position, which is that Canada is undecided. We'll come back to that. What is very interesting is some of the countries who have come out in support, places like Australia, or particularly the United States, who for decades has been kind of the bulldog of intellectual property protection internationally, but has said back in May that they would support a limited waiver for vaccines. So that's not really sufficient. Indeed, the waiver may actually be more effective for some of the other tools than for vaccines, but it's still a pretty remarkable step by the US, and one that Canada has as yet not even followed to that extent. So, I mean, what are we talking about here with patents and TRIPS and so on? So here's a map of the world by patents held by countries. So this gives an indication of which countries had a particular interest when setting up the WTO in having strong intellectual property protections in the TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And the TRIPS agreement so standardizes essentially intellectual property protections, and that had a real impact on things like pharmaceuticals, that prior to TRIPS in many countries, there were considerably lesser protections on pharmaceuticals in particular, given their particular societal role. Nonetheless, TRIPS itself, indeed, much like the underlying concept of a patent, is supposed to strike a balance between innovation and access, right? You see language here about mutual advantage of producers and users, conducive to economic and social welfare, etc. Unfortunately, this has not always panned out in practice. So why is the waiver being proposed? Well, one reason is that other ways of transferring this knowledge and technology have not worked. Voluntary mechanisms like the WHO's COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or CTAP, created in May 2020, nobody participated in it at all until November of 2021. There is now a serological test in CTAP. Indeed, the pharmaceutical industry actively indicated that they were not interested in participating. Similarly, they've not been interested in other proposals like the WTO head's proposed third way around the waiver that also rely heavily on voluntary participation. What are the reasons for this? Well, one is, to be blunt, money, right? Pfizer made $36 billion off this vaccine last year. Moderna, who I should note, had never made a product before. This is their first product. They made about 15 billion. But for vaccines in particular, it's not just about the vaccine. It's also about the underlying platform for the vaccine, which can be used for other things. And this is true of mRNA. It's true of a range of the vaccine platforms. So we have a situation where vaccine makers are worried that this waiver might allow other countries like China and Russia to have access to this platform, and they might use it to do nefarious things like curing cancer, which obviously would be terrible. We also see the importance of the platform indicated in other actions, indeed by some of the same companies, where they have been willing, and some credit is due here, where they have been willing to grant certain licenses for their therapeutics recently. So what is it about vaccines? Well, vaccines are complicated. And that's reflected in this statement by Moderna. This is in direct response to the original TRIPS waiver proposal. You look at the dates, essentially saying we don't need the waiver because, hey, we will not, during the pandemic, we will not enforce our patents against people making vaccines to respond to the pandemic. So, this sounds nice on paper, certainly. But to an extent, this relies on the complexity of the issue. And there's a couple facets to this. One of these facets is this issue that is getting some attention now of know-how. What is know-how? Well, if you think of a vaccine as a recipe, say you were to give me the recipe for the finest French souffle. Even if I had all the right ingredients, the right equipment, honestly, I am not going to make you a very good souffle. And that gulf there, that's know-how, essentially. So this is something that's a bit tricky. This is something that patents can actually be designed to rely on, right? How often have you encountered a recipe that talks about, a hint of this and a pinch of that, and, bake until ready, and you look at it and go, wow, it would be really good to have more information here. So, the transfer of know-how would greatly speed up the process of expanding production. And although companies say, well, it'll be too hard to do this, in reality, when they've been dealing with their own contractors to make the vaccines, they've had very optimistic views of transfer. Here's one from Moderna, expecting transfer to begin 1 month, production to begin the next. So really, you can look at the TRIPS waiver in different ways. I mean, are we talking about applying the waiver itself? Are we talking about leverage to actually get companies to do things like voluntarily transfer know-how? Because there are a lot of companies around the world that would support with transfer of know-how be capable of making some of these vaccines fairly quickly. In the interim, there are some that are trying without that sort of voluntary transfer, like Afrigen in South Africa, where we actually have a situation where they're relying on what Moderna has said. They're calling their bluff, that Moderna said they're not enforcing patents. Well, that's a bit risky because, of course, this is just a statement in a press release. It's not legally binding. And indeed, we've seen companies renege on those sorts of voluntary statements. We've seen that around pricing during the pandemic. We've had companies say, we won't raise prices during the pandemic, subsequently raise prices and justify that against all objective evidence by saying, well, we're doing it because the pandemic's over now. But this also points to another even bigger question, which where the waiver is a strong fit, which is the fact that most inventions these days, particularly things like vaccines, we're not talking about one patent. We're talking about numerous patents and numerous ingredients or components, often held by numerous different parties. So sure, maybe Moderna is saying they're not enforcing their patents, but you still have to deal with all the other patent holders, who hold patents on the lipid nanoparticle technology going into the mRNA vaccines that is the subject of litigation with Moderna currently. And we see this reflected actually in the vaccine contracts that companies are making with governments, right? We see this Pfizer actually getting governments to indemnify Pfizer against infringement complaints against Pfizer because these are so complicated. So here is somewhere where a broad tool like a waiver can be useful because it gets this off the table. You're not trying to deal with multiple parties, multiple patents, looking over your shoulder, fearing litigation. You're just going ahead. So what's Canada saying about all this? Well, here's one thing Canada was saying at the WTO, was suggesting that we don't really need the waiver because, in fact, we think that the TRIPS agreement itself is already flexible enough to allow countries to do whatever they need to do. And indeed, in the case of one of those flexibilities, Canada said, well, as the only member ever used this flexibility, we can thus observe on the basis of concrete experience that the system worked as intended, which we'll come back to. So let's look at some of these flexibilities, like in Article 31 of TRIPS. So again, these are allowed under TRIPS use without authorization of the rights holder. And I've highlighted in blue that this particular measure is predominantly for domestic use, which will come back into play. But the classic example of one of these measures would be a compulsory license of a patent, which is what it sounds like. You're not getting rid of the patent. The company still holds it. In fact, they get a royalty on the compulsory license. All they lose is the ability to control who that technology is licensed to. So when might you use something like a compulsory license? Well, you might use it in a situation like this, where no vaccine maker wants to make their vaccines in your country. Now, ultimately, Canada went a different direction on this with vaccines, as we'll come to, but that's not always been the case. In fact, Canada, for a long time, was very well known internationally for its use of compulsory licenses on pharmaceutical products. Particularly between the late 60s and the mid 80s, Canada did this hundreds of times for pharmaceuticals. And in fact, major Canadian generics companies like Apotex or Nova Pharm, which is now Teva Canada, were actually built in part on the back of widespread compulsory licensing. However, beginning in the mid 80s, in response to a range of factors, including trade agreements, NAFTA, and then the WTO, Canada has really scaled back on this, particularly granting pharmaceutical compulsory licenses as a matter of course. And the only time prior to the pandemic that we really seriously considered this was in relation to Cipro for anthrax in the wake of 9/11. But back to Canada, the WTO. So, Canada, again, pushing back, asking questions about the nature. We want evidence on the nature and scope of any concrete IP barriers that would require the TRIPS waiver. So very much just asking questions, kind of a thing. But let's contrast that with what Canada itself actually did earlier in the pandemic. Well, this is the COVID-19 Emergency Response Act. So this was in March of 2020, so very early on in the pandemic. One of the things this did was to amend the Patent Act to make it very easy to get a compulsory license in response to COVID-19. Essentially, if the Minister of Health says this is necessary for the public health emergency, it shall be granted. Very easy. Of course, in March of 2020, Canada didn't have a ton of concrete IP barriers that it was facing. We certainly didn't have any vaccines, didn't really have any patented therapeutics at the time. What Canada was doing was going, wow, we might face these in the future. Let's get them out of the way. And indeed, this particular measure around compulsory licenses was actually intended as a temporary response to COVID-19, like another proposal that we may have mentioned. So this was back in the days when we thought the pandemic was going to be over in 6 months, how naive we were. But Canada, this was only valid for 6 months. By the time it came to renew this particular measure, Canada had changed its approach to this as it started to sign vaccine contracts. So if you ask Canada about this discongruous approach, as I have, they'll say, no, these are totally different because, TRIPS allows all these domestic measures. WTO also allows you to have a waiver, but anyway. And it's true, as we've seen, TRIPS does allow compulsory licenses. TRIPS on paper says all kinds of nice things about measures for protecting public health and so on. One of the big issues globally is that in practice, when you're Brazil, you're South Africa, and you're trying to use flexibilities like compulsory licenses, yes, you're supposed to be allowed to do them. You will still have pharmaceutical companies going after you. You will still face pressure from big, powerful countries that don't like you doing this, that place, lean on you with trade and so on. And this is a reason that many countries have not used these flexibilities. And indeed, some have been intimidated out of even having the legal architecture in place domestically to do this at all. So that takes us to Article 31 bis, another flexibility, which you don't have to read. Article 31 bis is actually an amendment to TRIPS. And this amendment comes out of the Ministerial Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement on Public Health, which is better known as the Doha Declaration, which some of you may have heard of, just celebrated its 20th anniversary as a measure that is for access to medicines that's certainly valuable on paper anyway. For our purposes, the key piece here is paragraph 6. So paragraph 6 recognizes compulsory licenses, but also the complication, as we remember, this is for domestic use primarily. If you're South Africa or Brazil or Canada, and you actually have pharmaceutical capacity, that's one thing. But if you're a smaller or poorer country that doesn't have pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity, it's hard to actually make use of this right. So in very broad strokes, what paragraph 6 and subsequently Article 31 bis allow is manufacturers in a third-party country to essentially act as the manufacturer on behalf of a country without capacity. So to make that work, those third-party countries had to set up their own mechanisms to allow this to happen. And the first country in the world to do this was Canada, with the very modestly named Jean Chrétien Pledge to Africa Act, which, as we see here, is about facilitating access to pharmaceuticals in developing countries for epidemics. This created Canada's Access to Medicines Regime, or CAMR. So, great, we've got these TRIPS flexibility, flexibility in 31 bis. We've got a Canadian mechanism to operationalize it. How is this going? Here is a complete list of all the times that this TRIPS flexibility has been successfully used. I'll leave it up so you'll have time to read the whole thing. This has not in practice proven very effective, despite, again, all the hype in its creation. The only time this TRIPS flexibility has been used was for a shipment by a Canadian company of an HIV triple therapy to Rwanda, well over a decade ago. So this was criticized here in Canada, after this much heralded act, working very well. Apotex, the country that actually made the drug and shipped it, said they would never use this mechanism again. Other NGOs, folks like MSF, were also very critical of this. And again, this is the Canadian mechanism to operationalize this TRIPS flexibility that is the only time it has ever been used anywhere in the world. So essentially, nobody in the world thinks that Article 31 bis, TRIPS flexibility, is particularly effective, except apparently for Canada's delegation to the WTO, which thinks that Canada's experience shows that this works as intended. So somebody called Canada's bluff on this. Canadian company BioLease, they're in St. Catharines, said, all right, we'd like to manufacture the J&J vaccine. They've declined to license it to us, so we'd like to use CAMR. In fact, we have a client, Bolivia, would like to buy this vaccine from us. Bolivia is very keen on this, at very high level. Their Minister of Foreign Affairs has made numerous statements on this. And these statements essentially reiterate that calling on Canada to do exactly what Canada already said at the WTO is what countries should do, calling on Canada to follow through on its own claims. Unfortunately, at this point, the response from Canada has basically been crickets and tumbleweeds. This particular issue is still stuck at the first step, which is getting this product onto Schedule 1 of the Patent Act. So to be eligible for CAMR, the drug or vaccine has to appear on Schedule 1 of the Patent Act. How do you get there? You get there on the recommendation of the Minister of Innovation and the Minister of Health. Thus far, they have not recommended adding the J&J vaccine. In fact, they have not recommended the addition of any product in response to COVID-19. In fact, in the about 17 years that this has existed, these ministers have added very few products to Schedule 1. In fact, only 3 products have been added after its creation. Once was for that HIV triple therapy that went to Rwanda. Once was at the behest of Teva, tenofovir for HIV, TDF was added. And the third was actually Tamiflu that was added at the behest of BioLease. So they've at least got things onto Schedule 1 in the past. They've made it that far, although these latter 2 additions never went into production. So why have ministers been so reluctant to actually act on, again, the mechanism that Canada recommends using in this pandemic? Well, one of the reasons appears to be pharmaceutical company influence. So this is not new to Schedule 1. For example, the original list back in the day was originally supposed to include moxifloxacin, but actually Bayer lobbied to keep that off. So we have numerous Canadian experts who are calling on Canada, again, to follow through on doing what Canada has said should do. This is MSF's position as well, but with a caveat. As we see, this is a clumsy mechanism already, even if it's working. This is product by product, it's country by country. It's really not an appropriate mechanism in a pandemic. And this is an example where a broader tool like a waiver could be useful. So what's with Canada? Again, Canada's official position is that it's undecided on the TRIPS waiver. If you read a little closely, more closely, story's a bit different. Here's a statement by our Minister of Trade. This was just after the US came out and said they favored partial waiver for vaccines, where Canada remains committed to finding solutions and reaching an agreement that accelerates global vaccine production and does not negatively impact public health. There's only one political constituency who really pushes this idea that the TRIPS waiver would negatively impact public health, and that is indeed the pharmaceutical industry. And indeed, here is Canada's main pharma lobby group, Innovative Medicines Canada, saying exactly that in a statement the day before the minister's statement. And indeed, we've seen a massive uptick in pharma lobbying during this pandemic, massive uptick, and this appears to have affected Canada's response on the TRIPS waiver, response on CAMR, and on other things like the long gestating reforms to the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, or PMPRB, which is the mechanism Canada has to regulate excess pricing, which has been delayed again and again and again during the pandemic. So let's explore this pharmaceutical idea that, if we waived patents or even fiddled with them too much, that in the next pandemic, we won't get a vaccine if we do this. And that, of course, overlooks the massive role of other parties, particularly public funding in the creation of these vaccines. AstraZeneca, who, to be fair, have been a bit better about licensing and pricing, the research was about 97% publicly funded. For Pfizer, more accurately, the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, because it was really BioNTech doing the innovation, BioNTech heavily funded by Germany. Moderna, who again had never had a product before, heavily supported by Operation Warp Speed in the US. Here it becomes a question of, what strings were attached to this support, to this funding, and are those strings being pulled hard enough? So, are there other options? You might remember folks like Jonas Salk and the first polio vaccine, and his response to the question about patents being, no, there's no patent on the vaccine. Could you patent the sun? A bit closer to home, insulin at Connaught Labs. There was a patent on insulin, yes. It was transferred in public interest for the princely sum of $1. You probably can't read it here, but for you trivia buffs, it's not actually Banting and Best on the patent. Little pub trivia if the pubs are open. So, does this translate into the modern day? These are obviously older inventions. We've seen some interesting examples. Take a country like Cuba. And despite all the privations of sanctions and so on, Cuba's been able to develop multiple vaccines, roll them out, and indeed start sharing with other countries. Or in the past couple of weeks, we've had things like Corbavax, a new vaccine out of some institutes in Texas being manufactured in India, where they've said they're not even going to take out a patent in the interests of ensuring maximum transfer. and access. Now, this isn't to say these are perfect models or perfect vaccines. Indeed, in these particular cases, it would be really great to see a bit more data on them, honestly. But at the same time, this points to the fact that at the very least, other ways of doing this are possible. So these are things that Canada needs to consider, as Canada is revisiting not only its research strategies, but its manufacturing strategies. So, by all means, let's fund research, things like homegrown Canadian vaccines, homegrown literally in the case of something like the Medicago plant-based vaccine. Or, let's look at how to increase domestic production, whether that is at federally owned facilities or perhaps whether that is supporting privately owned facilities. But let's do this properly. Let's attach those strings. Let's remember that public funding for public health should yield public benefits, not just private dividends. Right? Let's make it clear what access provisions domestically and globally exist in support for research and manufacturing. And indeed, if we're going to throw money at things, let's explore other vaccine platforms that didn't get the support they needed. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the story of the Canadian Ebola vaccine that sat on a shelf for a number of years at the cost of lives, quite frankly, before finally coming out during the pandemic, or during the West African epidemic, rather. Same platform has got other interesting vaccines, ones that MSF's certainly interested in, Marburg, Lassa fever, even more importantly. We could be supporting these things. If we're developing public manufacturing, we could even be manufacturing these sorts of things, actually fulfilling that idea of Canada as a positive player in global health. Because, the pandemic has impacted many things in Canada, as we all know. But one of the things that has been impacted is Canada's international reputation, especially around this idea or image, or at least self-image, of being a good guy in public health, because we have not been a leader on vaccines. The best that we can say about Canada is that it was fairly financially generous in supporting COVAX. Unfortunately, financial support doesn't go as far when you haven't left any vaccines on the shelves to actually buy with that financial support. So, we need to reconsider what we're doing here, and we need to prioritize patients over patents. So, at the moment, yes, we're talking about the TRIPS waiver. That is one facet of doing this. It's not a total solution. Passing that won't lead to new doses of vaccine tomorrow. Although, of course, if we passed it in October 2020, that might be a different story. But IP is part of the problem. As I said at the beginning, it's not the only problem. But if we deal with IP, get it off the table, we can also stop using IP as an excuse not to deal with all those other issues, be it supply chains leading into vaccines or distribution chains leading out of vaccines. And, if we're at the point now where perhaps things are shifting away from an absolute supply problem to a distribution of that supply problem, that's perhaps true. But the fact we've just muddled our way to that point doesn't mean that we can just overlook these problems, not just for this pandemic, but for the next one. And don't worry, it's my last slide for timekeepers. This is something we're doing right now. We're in the very early stages of negotiating an international pandemic treaty. And if we can't come to an agreement on something as narrow and simple as the TRIPS waiver, does that bode well for a much larger in scope pandemic treaty? And indeed, if you're a country that took more than your share, is going against the global flow on intellectual property and similar issues, are you going to be looked at as a good faith negotiator at this negotiating table? Because ultimately, if we continue to just talk about the pandemic and solutions without actually doing them, The pandemic's not going anywhere unless we actually take the steps to actually follow through on the rhetoric about vaccine equity. So that is it from me. Please do reach out. I'm on Twitter too much, or by email. Yeah, and I guess questions, comments, concerns, etc. Thank you.